Welcome to episode 85 of Talking Dairy, brought to you by DairyNZ. I'm your host, Jac McGowan, and joining us is DairyNZ's Chief Science Advisor, Dr Bruce Thorrold. His main job is to turn money invested by dairy farmers into new systems and solutions to keep us farming well into the future. Bruce is joining us to talk about gene technologies. The government has moved recently to change the rules around gene technologies, and DairyNZ has examined both the opportunities and the risks for the dairy sector, and we're busy around the country talking to farmers about just that. So what is DairyNZ's position on gene technologies? What are farmers asking? And what could the future look like if greater access to these technologies comes to be? Bruce helps us break down all the facts as we talk about the current state of play in New Zealand compared to the rest of the world and the potential impact on our dairy farms. Kia ora, Bruce, and welcome to Talking Dairy. Before we talk about gene tech, let's talk about you. Tell us a little about your background and how you came to your role as Chief Science Advisor at DairyNZ.
Well, I just kind of followed my nose, really, Jack, and looked for interesting opportunities along the way. I finished at Lincoln University in 1983 and got a job working for the ministry as a scientist in Rotorua. Kind of just followed my nose from there, ended up at Whatawhata Research Station for a few years, got into environmental science and catchments and water quality work, got involved in the Lake Taupo policy process, and then I came over here to Dexcel, which was pre it being DairyNZ. Got thrown into a big animal genetics trial, which convinced me of the merits of breeding worth and genetic gain. And from there, when DairyNZ was formed, went into a role called Strategy and Investment, which was all about how do we spend farmers' money on research to generate a sustainable and profitable future for them. And in the last year or so, I've been in a role as Chief Science Advisor inside DairyNZ, bringing my science background and everything I've learned about science and farming in the last 40 years to help the company and help farmers.
And you are a farmer in your own right, correct?
There's a bunch of us on a dairy farm in the South Waikato, Northern King Country it is actually. It's on the other side of the Punia River. It's 340-odd cows. We've got great contract milkers down there at the moment, Anna and Ash. And I spend a bit of time down there. I enjoy farming. I was going to go share milking until about the last year at university, and I got the research bug and ended up here. So I enjoy just the hands-on outside animals work of farming.
Okay, so today is about the facts and distilling very clearly the state of play on gene tech in New Zealand. So let's start with definitions. What do we even mean by gene technology?
Well, gene technologies is the broadest single term. It's all the things we do to breed better plants and animals and all the tools we use, particularly with plants, to insert or manipulate DNA.
Within gene technology, there's a few other things that some of us know and some of us don't. So we've got genes, which is a unit of inheritance. What else can we do with genes? What sits within gene technology?
The history of gene technology or breeding, if you want to think, because that's what we've done historically, has been selective breeding. Find the best, breed them to the best, and just keep on improving generation after generation. And the beauty is that we know that works. There's plenty of evidence in animals and plants that breeding like that works really well. But it's limited in terms of what it can do. It can only work inside the variability you've got in plants unless you can create more variability through mutagenesis of one form or another. So the modern gene technologies, genetic modification and gene editing, allow us to do a lot more. We started with genetic modification probably in the 1970s, and the easiest way to think of this is genetic modification involves bringing DNA from outside a species into a species. So taking DNA from a rice plant and putting it in a ryegrass plant. That's gene engineering or genetic modification. And at the other end of the scale, and we'll have heard a lot about this lately, has been gene editing. Gene editing is more precise than genetic modification, just through the techniques that are using, the science that's being developed. The easiest way to think about this is that gene editing usually involves manipulating a plant's own DNA one way or another And genetic modification usually involves bringing DNA in from outside that species. That's not 100% accurate, but it's a really nice way of thinking about how we go about changing animals and plants.
Okay, so the government's talking about changing the rules around gene technologies. Where is New Zealand currently at with all of this?
Well, right now, people talk about there being a ban on the use of field trialling of GM organisms. I mean, that's not true. There are a set of rules which allow you to do this, but the reality is the rules are so onerous and the process is so expensive that nobody's had a go at it for years. And in the rest of the world, the use of GM and gene editing crops is widespread. So the aim is to change the regulations in ways that make it a lot simpler to field trial and then release gene-edited or modified plants or animals. And to do this, while we manage the risks, the government is proposing setting up a system quite like Australia's, where there is a separate regulator whose job it is to assess the risks to human health and the environment of these technologies and approve or not approve or put conditions on any kind of release.
Okay, so how does that compare with what's happening in the rest of the world?
So the approach that the government has been talking about is modelled very closely on the Australian system, which has a single regulator that looks at the risks to the environment and to human health. It takes a tiered approach to organisms that are submitted to it for release. So the more change there is in the plant or the animal through gene technology, the higher level of approval or the conditions on managing that out in the open. All around the world, in the US and Britain, similar sorts of regimes work. The EU currently is much, much more restrictive, but they're also looking at freeing up their regulations in a way similar to this.
Will these regulations apply to all gene technologies in New Zealand?
We haven't seen the detail of the legislation yet, which is really important. It's certainly going to apply to anything we would think of as gene editing or genetic modification right now, but we still need to see what's proposed before we understand the full scope.
Okay, so talk me through the opportunities for the New Zealand dairy sector if greater access to gene tech comes to be.
I think it's really important to be realistic about what's in the pipeline now and what might come in the future. So right now, if I look at the seeds you can hold in your hands, what's in the pipeline? Well, we've got some plants that are potentially much better. AgResearch has done a lot of really great work in this. So we've got high lipid ryegrass, we've got a condensed tannin white clover, and we've got some gene-edited endophytes. Now, those plants have the potential to reduce methane emissions, to be positive in the way they impact nitrogen cycling and reduce nitrate leaching, and the potential to increase animal productivity. So, these things are in the pipeline. The evidence is that, the huge step changes that people talk about, with GM, they're not evident. We might be 10 or 20% gains at a paddock level, but that's pretty material in terms of the rates of productivity gain in the sector now, which are pretty low. Those are the things we can see. The other things we could see right now would be, maize crops. So, a lot of GM maize grown all around the world with drought and insect pest resistance. So potentially some of that plant material may be beneficial in New Zealand. And that's, a large part of what's in the pipeline right now. Now, in 20 or 30 years, we might be able to do all sorts of things that we kind of can't really comprehend right now with forages and potentially with animals. But we need to be realistic that the gains are going to be incremental. But of course, if we don't get started, we're never going to make any progress.
Okay, so it sounds like there's some promise there, but also some consequence of not being able to do field trials for quite some time means we're starting again.
The plants we've been talking about have been field trialled overseas, so we've been forced, the science organisations have been forced to go to Australia or go to the US to do the field trials. The first thing that we would do in New Zealand, I'm sure, is do the kind of field trials in New Zealand we've done overseas to test the performance of these plants under local conditions, local weather, local climate, sunshine, and make sure that the traits we're looking for in those plants, the traits that have been engineered into them, are still there. So does the condensed tannin levels stay up? Do the lipid levels stay up? Have we got plants that we can really see the benefits of and be worth then taking through to animal testing?
Okay, so some potential to access solutions that are out there already internationally and make sure they work for us here.
Well, some of them are our solutions. Most of
That's
them are.
true.
So the work that's been done by Ag Research and funded by some by us, some by Grasslands Technology, and some by the commercial sector and the government. It's world-leading science. We should be very impressed with the work that they've done. And if with the regulations change, we have the opportunity now to test those plants in our conditions and potentially use them, because we've now got a real choice. If there's nothing in the pipeline, we'll be having a theoretical discussion about GM, but now we've got choices to make. So these plants are potentially really beneficial in terms of the environment and productivity. We know we've got a bunch of challenges in front of us as a sector which we want to deal with, but we need tools. We need tools that fit into our system, don't bring about huge increases in cost because of inputs, but allow us to solve the problem. So we need to know what these plants can do for us.
And you've talked about plants. You mentioned animals. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what potential beneficial animal traits there might be.
Yeah, there's been much less work done on animals, and it's actually quite hard to know where that's going to land in terms of potential. Probably the two most likely candidates now would be polled animals, so being able to use gene editing to make cattle polled, and hornless. So right now there are lines of cattle, including dairy cattle, that don't have horns, and you can buy that as an AI product. Gene editing would allow that process to be sped up and inserted into the breeding the breeding system much more easily, but that's some distance away.
We've talked about opportunities. With most opportunities comes some risks. What risks might the New Zealand dairy sector have to navigate here?
There's a number of really important things we need to think about, and the government and in fact the whole country need to think about in terms of the use of these technologies. The most obvious one is our markets and our customers. As farmers know well, 95% of our milk is exported, and the customers and consumers who buy those dairy products are critically important to us. So that's an area where the milk processors, I'm sure, are doing work to understand what their consumers and customers are looking for. And it's worthwhile remembering that milk processors sell to different markets. It may be that there's not a united view, and we need to think about the different markets we work with and how a coexistence strategy, just like we do now for organics, could apply. MPI has also done quite a lot of work in this space. So we're looking to the processors and MPI to be the experts in our markets. In talking to our farmers, it's clear that there is concern, obviously, for markets, but there's also concern, particularly amongst our Maori levy payers, around whakapapa and how does these new technologies intersect with their values. So that's something collectively that we need to really think about and figure out if we can find a solution to those concerns. And lastly, there's the risk, which is really where the gene regulator comes in around environmental risks, weediness. Are we going to see traits get into weed or wild populations, and what are the impacts of those going to be? So those are the risks, and then we need solutions, and solutions are going to be about management. So you'll hear people talk a lot about coexistence, which is the way in which those different systems, with or without GM products, farmers can farm in the same communities, and milk processors can operate and pick up milk and separate it and meet their customers' expectations. So there's a lot of work to be done on coexistence, because having talked to farmers and the milk processors, it's clear that if we can't come up with a decent coexistence strategy, we're not going to be able to move forward very well.
Does DairyNZ have a position in regards to gene technology?
Yes, we think that it's time to look at change. The regulations are out of date. The science is advanced. There's a whole lot of new technologies, as we talked about before, available. We've got a bunch of issues to face, and we need all the help we can get to face into them and solve the problems. But we've just talked about risks. There's a need to move carefully and actually think about those risks consider and find solutions to the views of stakeholders in our markets, and work to a solution that we can embrace.
And how are we as DairyNZ engaging with farmers around this?
So we've been talking to some farmer groups already, and we plan to do a lot more in the next few months. We need to see from the government what those regulations are going to be. We're not sure whether they're going to turn up yet, because a lot of the devil is in the detail in terms of how we might respond. But what we're hearing from farmers so far, fundamentally there's two views. There's a view which says, let's get into this. We need all the help we can get. Let's be careful. And there's a view which says, no, this is not the right thing to do, whether it's our markets or our values. So you don't reconcile those two views by taking the average of them. And that's why coexistence is so important, because if we're going to respect the choices and the values of individual farmers and markets, we need to have a way of living with these technologies, alongside people who choose not to use them.
And what else have you been hearing from farmers on the subject? What do they want to know about?
Well, exactly the things you'd expect them to know about with any new technology. What does this mean for my farm system? What does it mean for productivity and profitability? Who's selling me the seed and who's making all the money? If my milk processor doesn't want GM milk, what does that mean to me? If they are happy with it, but I'm producing non-GM milk, which I think is better, do they just mix it all in together? Customers. Let's be really sure that we are doing the right thing here. And values. How does this line up with my values? Those are the things we've been talking about.
What could the dairy sector look like in 5 to 10 years with new gene tech in the mix?
The changes that we may be using in the sector in 5 to 10 years are the plants we can see now. How might it look different? Better pastures. Pastures which have high energy, low emissions plants in them, being managed from the roadside. They won't look any different. They'll look like ryegrass and white clover, maybe with a bit of plantain chucked in as well. But farmers will, through the record keeping that'll need to be done, will be able to show, whether it's in their insights reports or their inventory returns, here is the measures I'm using and here are the greenhouse gas gains I'm getting out of it. All going well, they'll see productivity gains and more milk in the vat for the same amount of inputs. Inevitably, there's going to be more record keeping in this, and that's been a pretty clear message right the way through. But of course, there's a whole bunch of new sophisticated GPS-linked data interoperability initiatives underway, so I'm sure that'll be seamless.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the potential benefits for dairy farming. What are the wider possibilities with these gene technologies outside of dairy farming?
It's not an area that I know well, so I'm probably just speaking as an interested citizen now. The pest control stuff is obviously pretty exciting. We're predator-free 2050, stoats, rats, possums gone, allowing our birds to enjoy a predator-free lifestyle. It sounds pretty crazy to me. They might have to navigate a few cats still, though. That sounds pretty exciting. Technically, how feasible is it? How will communities feel about risks and all the things we've just talked about plants if we're bringing gene drives or other things into that? So that's pretty interesting. In the medical world, of course, genetic modification is used extensively now for production of vaccines and other kind of medical things. The precision fermentation, of course, so we've read a bit about that. So precision fermentation is a GM technology. Those yeasts are bioengineered to make those dairy proteins. There are competitive threats as well as advantages, from the application of GM technologies around the world.
You're talking about alternatives to milk.
Exactly. Yeah, so precision fermentation uses GM engineered yeasts, I think they are, to turn sugar into milk proteins. It's not all upside. The competitive advantage that gene technology used in the States or in Australia or Europe, also has the potential to put us under competitive pressure for productivity and footprint here too. So we've got to understand what's happening in the rest of the world as well as what's happening here.
Well, Bruce, thanks so much for translating a very complex issue, and we've only touched on the high-level stuff here. So translating a very complex issue and sharing that with us. Seems to me the government's review is timely. The science has advanced, moved on, and there are some really real benefits to the sector and to other sectors, of course, as well. The pest management's exciting to me too, but there's also some real risks that do need to be managed carefully. It's good to know, Bruce, that you're knee-deep in it for all of us, and we look forward to hearing more as this issue dials up over the next few months. Evidence-based information is the cornerstone of progress, and I thank you very much for taking the time to share that with us. Mā te wā, mauri ora. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Talking Dairy. Make sure to hit follow so you can keep up to date with our latest episodes. You can also keep up with DairyNZ News on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn, or go to our website and sign up for our fortnightly DairyNZ News emails. As always, if you have any feedback on this podcast or have some ideas for future topics or guests to have on the show, please email us at talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. Mā te wā, mauri ora, catch you next time.